Alô pessoal, estamos aqui acompanhando ao vivo o speech do Powell. Então vamos lá.
Our job.
What about the effects of tariffs on quantities? With the level of tariffs that, for example, have been currently applied on China, there's a fear that the supply chain may get disrupted, that firms may not be able to import their relevant stuff from China given the level of prices. If it turns into a supply shock, would the Fed's response be different than if it was primarily something which affected just prices?
So I actually had dinner at the Chicago Fed last night and with a number of directors of various parts of the Chicago Fed, and many of them are CEOs of significant companies, and they this uncertainty that they're feeling and the issue with imported components to their products is just a huge issue. But with if you look back at the pandemic, if you remember, there was a shortage of semiconductors, and that led to a shortage of cars at a time of extremely high car. And it was a prolonged shortage because production couldn't keep up. And that led to an extended period, one of the things that led to an extended period.
Estamos tendo algum problema aqui, peraí, gente. Peraí que estamos tendo algum problema aqui técnico, peraí. Tá, vamos ver.
What do you think about all this? Immigration, you talked about the labor markets being in reasonable equilibrium right now. Of course, what we've seen over the last few months, the last months of the previous administration continuing into this administration, is immigration has fallen off considerably. What's your sense on how that will affect the labor market?
So part of why growth was so strong in the last couple of years was just very high levels of immigration, and those people went to work. The economy hired them. There was a lot of demand. We were still working off the labor shortage. What's happened since the prior administration changed their policy, as you mentioned, immigration has fallen very sharply, and therefore the growth of workers has really stopped. It's really stagnant. But at the same time, demand has also fallen. And so demand for workers, so payroll job creation has also fallen, and they've kind of fallen in tandem, which is why the unemployment rate has been pretty stable for about a year. So in a way, demand and coincidental.
Ele falou que, na verdade, né, se você olhar o número de empregos, né, o número de imigrantes caiu, mas também o número de empregos também caiu. Então, está falando que a taxa de desemprego tem se mantido bem estável ao longo aí desse período, né, desses meses da última administração, aliás.
The effects of immigration are not thought to matter.
E parou agora de novo.
Work today is
não.
broken. We're all working in too many disconnected apps, and it's killing team productivity.
Propaganda, gente, propaganda.
But for the first time, there's a platform that fixes it by combining everything you need. Projects.
Vamos continuar. Aqui parou um pouco, travou aqui a minha recepção. Peraí, deixa eu ver. Vou ver se tem algum comentário das pessoas. Boa tarde, Japa. Boa tarde, Alex. Tudo bem? Cadê? Boa tarde, Alex. Já para todos pensando que ia ser um pronunciamento, um bate-papo, pelo jeito não teremos movimentação até a próxima postagem de Trump. O que acha? Não, eu acho que teremos sim, eu acho que teremos, e essa movimentação vai ser para baixo, viu? Cadê? Então eu acho que essa movimentação vai ser para baixo, Bruno. Então vamos voltando lá. Cadê?
In research establishments and universities in jobs. How
To be in terms of what to do, and so we, the best we can do is we actually have a little provision in our consensus statement, which is the thing that we vote on to embody how we approach these questions. What we say is we will look at how far the economy is from each of those two goals, and then we'll ask, might there be different paces at which they would approach those goals. We'll look at those things and think about them, and we'll make what will no doubt be a very difficult judgment. Again, we're not experiencing that now, but we could well be in that situation, as I mentioned in my remarks.
Just want to pick up on a word that is often used today, uncertainty. As a respondent to a Dallas Fed survey said, I've never felt more uncertainty about my business in my entire 40-plus years career.
Uncertainty.
The worry today is not just about immediate policy uncertainty, but an entire change in the U.S.'s economic philosophy. Not just policy uncertainty, so to speak, but structural uncertainty. One of the effects, as you've pointed out, of higher levels of uncertainty is that firms postpone investment. For instance, even after the tariffs stabilize, firms that contemplate reshoring production facilities will hesitate, not knowing if the tariffs will be reversed in the future, maybe by the next administration. How do you take such longer-term uncertainty into account in your policies?
Vamos ver, isso aqui vai deixar marcado, hein? Vamos ver.
So let me just agree that what comes back very strongly, and everyone will understand this. These are very fundamental changes in, long held in some cases policies in the United States, and there's not any real experience. I mean, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were actually not this large, and they were 95 years ago, so there isn't a modern experience of how to think about this. And businesses and households are saying in surveys that they are experiencing incredibly high uncertainty. There's a lot of research, some of it from the Fed, showing that does lead to businesses and households stepping back from decisions, which of course makes common sense. And you hope that that's something that you go through a phase, and then you know what things become more certain, and therefore people can resume normal economic activities given their understanding of what is the new normal. I mean, your question really is, what if the uncertainty remains high? I think that's a difficult environment. I think people's expected rates of return would have to be higher. I think people that would weigh on, to me, investment just in general. If the United States were to become a jurisdiction where risks are just structurally higher going forward, that would make us less attractive as a jurisdiction. We don't know that at this point, but I think that would be the effect.
Well, let me turn to financial markets. We've seen some volatility, especially stock market volatility. I mean, the levels of the VIX are up to the levels they were in the early days of the pandemic, coming off somewhat now. Some people believe the Fed will intervene if the stock market plummets, the so-called Fed put.
Acho que está bem claro que o Powell tem uma visão bem ruim, né? Falou que incerteza vai continuar.
Say no with an explanation. So what I think is going on in markets is markets are processing what's going on, and it's really the policies, particularly the trade policy, and really the question is, where's that going to come in? Where's that going to land? And we don't know that yet. And until we know that, you can't really make informed assessments that would still be highly uncertain. Once you know what the policies are, it'll still be highly uncertain what the economic effects will be. So markets are struggling with a lot of uncertainty, and that means volatility. But having said that, markets are functioning. Conditional on being in such a challenging situation, markets are doing what they're supposed to do. They're orderly, and they're functioning just about as you would expect them to function.
So we've seen volatility also in the bond market, and at a time when usually there's a flight to safety, we saw yields on the German Bund and the Japanese government bond come down, but we saw yields on U.S. Treasuries go up. What do you attribute this to?
So I would just say the same thing. I think it's very hard to know in real time. I've had a lot of experience with significant moves, for example, in the bond market, where there's a narrative that people land on, and then 2 months later you look back and go, that was completely wrong. So I think it's very premature to say exactly what's going on. Clearly, there's some delevering going on among hedge funds in levered trades and things like that. It's also, again, it's the markets processing historically unique developments. And with great uncertainty.
Na verdade, o que o Powell está falando é o que eu imaginei que ele ia falar mesmo. Ele ia falar que está muito cedo para falar alguma coisa, que tem que estar prematuro.
The certainty about how much reserves and liquidity the market needed, and you wanted to take a little more time to find that out?
Aí, ô Fred, qual que é a melhor IA para estudar?
É o Gemini do Google. Ela resume videoaula do YouTube, organiza arquivo no Google Drive, é bem bom para estudar, sabe?
E Fred, qual que é a melhor IA para automatizar tudo do meu trabalho?
O ChatGPT, com certeza. O ChatGPT você pode enviar.
Café.
Peraí, voltamos.
Market people, that'll make sense. But while those big flows are happening for over a period of 6 months, we would actually be shielded from being able to see evidence that we were or were not getting close to the level of less abundant reserves. And so we decided to slow the pace. We thought about pausing, and instead we debated it. It's one of these great debates that we have at the FOMC. We decided to slow the pace instead. And people really came to see the merits of that, because the slower we go, the less the smaller the balance sheet can get without disruptions. And we want that process to continue, and now it's at quite a slow pace. So we think that's a really good thing. So that means it can go on for a longer amount of time, and we'll be able to reach kind of very carefully what we think is the right level of reserves. Still plenty of reserves.
What about the international dollar-based system? With all these disruptions, do you stand ready to supply dollars to central banks as you've done in the past when there's been a global shortage of dollars?
Sure, absolutely we do. Just for everyone's knowledge, we have standing dollar swap lines with 5 large central banks, and they go to the jurisdictions where there are big overseas dollar funding markets. And in fact, those are overseas markets where, for example, a European or Asian institution is buying an asset-backed security that is backed by loans to American consumers. So in effect, these are loans to American consumers, and we support that. We want to make sure that dollars are available. They need dollar funding to hold those dollar assets. So the way it works is, when needed, we lend to the central bank in dollars, and they pay us back in dollars. They then pay in their currency. They lend on in dollars. And so we take no credit risk or anything like that, and it supports dollar funding markets. Dollar funding markets are very sensitive during times of crisis, and it's very helpful. The reason we do it is it's really good for U.S. consumers. So we'll continue to do that, just as part of the dollar being a reserve currency, the reserve currency, most important, and we will do that.
You mentioned amongst the issues you were focused on was the U.S. fiscal situation. Well, clearly, U.S. sovereign debt continues to rise. And what are your thoughts on the longer-term implications for interest rates and economic stability?
Nossa,
How much further can we go in terms of national debt before we cross a line that might be unsustainable in the long term?
Nossa, vamos ver agora. Agora é importante.
The U.S. federal debt is on an unsustainable path. It's not at an unsustainable level, and no one really knows how much further we can go. Other countries over time have gone much farther, but we're now, we're running very large deficits at full employment. And this is a situation that we very much need to address. Sooner or later we'll have to, and sooner is better than later. In terms of, if I can say from my time working on these issues, it's not the Fed's issue, but if you look at a pie chart of federal spending, the biggest parts and the parts that are growing are Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and now interest payments. And so that's really where the work has to be done. And those are issues that can only be touched on a bipartisan basis. Neither party can figure out what to do without both parties being at the table. So that's critical. All of this domestic discretionary spending, which is essentially where 100% of the conversation is small as a percentage of federal spending and is declining it's already declining as a percentage of federal spending. So when people are focusing on cutting domestic spending, they're not actually working on the problem. Domestic discretionary spending is already going down. I like to make that point because so much of the dialogue that the politicians offer is about domestic discretionary spending, which is not the issue.
Well, let's turn to stability and regulation. Turning to the U.S. financial sector, we still have some concerns about distressed commercial real estate loans on bank balance sheets, whether they've been fully dealt with so far. There's some sense that they haven't. Add to that the very rapid growth in various forms of private credit over the last few years, which arguably...
Vamos ver como estão os mercados agora, vamos ver.
With liquidity and is quite resilient right now to the kinds of shocks that it may face. I do believe that. In terms of the commercial...
Eu avisei, eu estava correto que o mercado ia derreter. O mercado está caindo muito agora, né? Olha só o mercado agora.
Banks who have elevated concentrations of commercial real estate, some of it troubled, and we've been working to make sure that those banks have a plan, have capital, and can absorb the losses that they're doing. So, and that's been going on for some time. The very largest banks don't tend to have high concentrations. So this is a problem that we have known would take years to work through, but we're really well into the process of working through it. In terms of the non-bank financial sector, it's grown enormously. The provision of credit by non-banks has grown just really fast. Most of it has been funded, though, with a private equity-like structure where it's limited partners who are signed up for 10 years to a general partner to invest that money. They're not depositors who can run. Your money's committed. And so that funding model is kind of run-proof. That isn't some law of nature, though. So when you do start to see shorter-term funding creeping in, to your point, though, Raghu, this very fast-growing and now quite large private credit part of the economy has not really been through a significant credit event or significant. It's really grown since the pandemic. And
legal, vamos ver se tem mais alguma pergunta das pessoas. Oi, Fernando, tudo bem? Boa tarde, JAPA. Boa tarde, Fernando. Então vamos continuando aqui ao vivo.
Institutional investors signed up for a long period,
Vocês
but we're watching carefully.
Comigo. Right, wearing my banking research hat, actually banks are also involved in funding these institutions in a big way. Yeah. We do know the administration wants to relax regulations in many areas, one of which may well be banking. What can you tell us about the Basel III endgame, so to speak, which is, at this point primarily focused on additional capital for the large banks?
The Fed view, and my view, is that we should proceed to complete the Basel III accord, and we would have to do that, and would look forward to doing that in conjunction with the FDIC and the OCC. But our view is, and I think the bank's view as well, is we should complete that. You need international minimum standards. That's kind of a common good, and we're not bound by them. Really, nothing. The United States has plenty of input into what the
Super híbridos BYD, até 44.
Aqui veio uma propaganda.
The potential for more favorable regulations coming on them and potential risks from that for the system.
So we went through a wave of failures and fraud and things like that were the headlines for a couple of years, and I think what you see now is and during that period, by the way, we worked with Congress to try to get a framework, a legal framework for stablecoins, which would have been a nice place to start. We were not successful. I think that the climate is changing, and you're moving into sort of more mainstreaming of that whole sector. So Congress is again looking at both the Senate and the House are looking at a framework, a legal framework for stablecoins. Depending on what's in it, that's a good idea. We need that. There isn't one now. And stablecoins are a digital product that could actually have fairly wide appeal and should contain consumer protections of the typical sorts and transparency. And that's what the Senate and the House are working on. So that's a positive thing. I also think some of the, we took a pretty conservative, and other bank regulators took an even more conservative perspective on the guidance and rules we imposed on banks. I think there'll be some loosening of that, and I think we'll try to do it in a way that preserves safety and soundness, but that permits and fosters appropriate innovation, but that does so in a way that again doesn't put consumers at risk in ways they don't understand or make bank.
Na verdade, o Powell está sendo bem protecionista em relação a cripto, assim como ele sempre tem falado, na verdade, né?
Recently tell us there seems to be a distinction between a rise in the level of prices, which is what the public seems to worry a lot about, and the rate of increase in prices, which certainly they worry about in passing, but the Fed worries much more about. That is the rate of inflation. So even though we're coming down to 2%, people remember that over the last few years it's been over 20% increase in prices. So as you start thinking about the policy review, is there any thought about how you might want to address this sort of challenge, that it's the path of prices as much as the rate of change which matters?
First of all, I think you're right, and I think the public is right. When we say inflation is back down to 2%, 2.5%, and we think that's a good thing, it is a good thing. But if you're paying 20% more than you were paying in 2021, that doesn't help you much. You're still paying a lot more than you used to be paying for the necessities of life. So it's just another way of saying people hate inflation, and it's easy to understand why. All we can really control is a world in which, in the world we were living in, prices don't go down in the aggregate except in extreme times that we don't want to court. So I don't think we couldn't have a framework where we're going to bring prices down by 10% or something. That's not something we'll be looking at. We're essentially looking at the best way to foster 2% inflation over time. And the things we did back in the changes we made in 2020 were really innovations around what to do when you're stuck near zero. Now we're well above zero, and it may be that we still need to have in our framework a way to deal with that, but perhaps the main case is not one where you're dealing with the effective lower bound, and that would be a framework that looks a lot more like the one that we had before 2020.
Now, one of the tools you brought in to deal with the zero lower bound was quantitative easing. But you've also used quantitative easing to fix disruptions in the financial markets. Are you going to be more specific about what your objective is with quantitative easing as you go through this review?
So in the beginning, it's typically we're using it for financial market function. That was the case with the global financial crisis and with the pandemic. And we did try to explain ourselves through the pandemic, and our explanations did change. But I think it's
legal que tá falando sobre quantitative easing, porque eu coloquei aquela imagem, né, no stories do Jerome Powell imprimindo dinheiro. É isso que estão falando agora.
Discussion is complete without talking about AI.
Yeah.
With AI coming fast and furious, it could affect productivity, it could affect employment. There are some people who say we will see for the first time technological unemployment in a serious way with AI. What are your thoughts about it, and how will it impact the Fed going forward?
So like everyone who's been exposed to what it's capable of, it's beyond, I started thinking about it as a version of Google, but it's not. It's like a better version of a person, you know. It can do amazing things.
Você acabou de falar que, na verdade,
the question is,
inteligência artificial é uma versão melhor de uma pessoa.
Technology evolves and people worry that it's going to replace human labor and people will be unemployed, and that hasn't been the case. It may be the case in the short run, but in the long run what it's done is raise human productivity and therefore living standards. So is this going to be the case where it eliminates more jobs than it creates? And we just don't know. You come back in 20 years, will it be the case that just people are much more productive in their work because of AI? Or will it be the case that AI has just replaced a lot of people? And I think it's very hard to say, but it truly is remarkable in what it's capable of. And it's, we had a demonstration by a Wharton professor recently, and you speak to it like it's a person, and it kind of responds like a person, and the things that it can do are really amazing. By the way, this is early days. They're talking about even the next couple of years will bring more dramatic breakthroughs. So I think it's one of the two or three.
Na verdade, a gente está bem no comecinho de inteligência artificial ainda, né?
Economy all around the world in the next 20 years, and I'd say very hard to say how it shakes out.
Verdade.
Let me turn to your
difícil de
job.
saber o que vai acontecer.
An important
Vamos ver se tem algum comentário das pessoas. JAPA, você acredita que o dólar pode ser... JAPA, você acredita... JAPA, você acredita que o dólar possa ser substituído por outra moeda nas negociações entre países? Sim, acredito. Acredito e acho que a China quer fazer exatamente isso. Eu acho que, não agora, mas não de imediato, mas eu acredito que ao longo dos anos a China consiga substituir o dólar, sim. Acredito que é possível, sim. Qual país teria coragem?
Nem que seja um pouquinho, vale a pena.
Então, a China, eu acho que a China já está fazendo isso no Sudeste Asiático, tá? Já conseguiu, na verdade. Então, a longo prazo, a China vai conseguir substituir o dólar, sim, tá? Vai. Eu acredito que com essas guerras de tariffs, às vezes podem sair, mas... Então, não. Aí eu já não sei. Vamos continuar.
Monday, in that office, what are the key indicators you look for? What are the sources of data that you go to as you try and make up your mind?
So, I'd say start with labor. There's more labor market data and better reliable labor market than probably anywhere else. And it's just a lot of data. And, it's new jobs, it's payroll, it's wages, it's participation. You can break all of those down in different categories. It's a million different things. So there's a lot of labor market data. It's a great field if you're going into economics because there's just so much to do. So and then we look at the inflation data. Also, I keep track of global developments pretty carefully, and I talk to my global counterparts pretty regularly.
O entrevistador acabou de perguntar para o Powell o que você analisa.
Are really important.
Aí o Powell está falando, primeira coisa, labor, né, emprego, né? E aí vem salário, pessoas, talento, né? Ele falou várias coisas que influem. E depois ele está falando sobre inflação também.
For a significant part of my career, and I have to talk to outsiders about what they're seeing and what they're dealing with for it to really kind of fit together for me. I can look at only so much data, and but to really get the story and the narrative, it's more talking to outsiders, and anecdotal data does help things kind of fit together for me, I would say.
You told us about speaking with business people last night and getting a sense of what was going on in the Midwest. Let me turn to Fed independence. You've reiterated that you intend to stay in office until the end of your term, and that certainly reassured many in financial markets. What are the levers the government or the legislature have to pressure the Fed? And should one worry about threats to the Fed's independence once you're gone?
So our independence is a matter of law.
Isso aqui é uma pergunta bem importante, né, sobre a independência do Federal Reserve em relação ao governo. Né? Não sei se você sabe, mas o Federal Reserve é independente do governo. E aí,
So we're protected in the law. So Congress could change that law, but I don't think there's any danger of that. Fed independence has pretty broad support. The Supreme Court case, people will have read probably in today's journal at which the Supreme Court may decide whether independent agencies generally, whether they're authorizing laws, can contain a provision that prevents the president from firing members of a commission other than for cause. And that's a case that people are talking about a lot. I don't think that decision will apply to the Fed, but I don't know. But it's a situation that we're monitoring carefully. Generally speaking, Fed independence is very widely understood and supported in Washington, in Congress where it really matters. And the point is, we can make our decisions, and we will only make our decisions based on our best thinking, based on our best analysis of the data about what is the way to achieve our dual mandate goals as we can to best serve the American people. That's the only thing we're ever going to do. We're never going to be influenced by any political pressure. People can say whatever they want. That's fine. That's not a problem. But we will do what we do strictly without consideration of political or any other extraneous factors.
Isso é legal. Legal o que ele falou. Eu vou continuar fazendo o trabalho dele independentemente de outras, né, razões políticas ou influências políticas. Ele é independente, ele vai continuar fazendo o trabalho do Federal Reserve, porque o Federal Reserve é independente do que acontece na política dos Estados Unidos, né?
Do you mean I have nobody to practice with?
Yes. How can I learn
Question. The question I want to ask is a more personal one. What is it that you'd like to do most at home after an exhausting day flipping coins in the office?
O que ele gosta de fazer em casa?
I play one of my guitars. I do Zoom calls with my kids and my grandkids, and I go to the gym a lot too, just to stay in shape.
We need you healthy. We need you healthy. Thank you very much, Chair Powell.
Thank you.
And please join me.
Beleza, então vocês acabaram de ver a entrevista ao vivo. Pensei que seria mais um discurso, mas foi mais, na verdade, uma entrevista. Mas enfim, o que vocês acharam sobre isso, escrevam aqui. Vamos ver se tem algum mais comentário. Então, respondendo mais uma vez a pergunta do Fernando, eu não sei. Eu acho que tem muita incerteza ainda. Vou falar a mesma coisa que o Powell disse, tá? Então, se essas guerras de tarifas dos Estados Unidos podem ser muito machucados, talvez sim, né? Além de Estados Unidos machucados, também outros países também vão ser machucados, mas o que eu acho é que ainda tem muita incerteza sobre o que vai acontecer. Então, estou falando mais ou menos o que o Powell está falando, tá? Então, tem muita incerteza no mercado, a gente vai ser... Só que uma coisa eu sei, quanto mais incerteza no mercado, mais o mercado cai, tá? Mais os índices caem, e mais o ouro sobe, tá? E mais euro, franco suíço e ouro, esses três continuam subindo, e quanto mais tem incerteza, os índices Bitcoin derretem, tá? Então o JAPA poderia substituir. Seria mais bonito, né, na verdade. Ohayou gozaimasu.